Hi, I'm Jamie from Stonemaier Games, and today I'm excited to talk about a topic that I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of game design and the games that I've been playing, and that is games that feature cards where both sides of the cards matter. Both sides of the cards have something printed on them that matter. So for this video, I am not counting games like Wingspan, where you can use cards as counters. You can like tuck cards in Wingspan under other bird cards. I'm not counting that. That's a great use of a card as a counter. I'm not counting that for this list. I'm counting it where there's something printed on the back of the card that matters, where you need to read whatever is printed on the back of the card, and sometimes on the front of the card. There's a surprisingly large number of games that do this, and I do want to start out by saying, from a game design perspective, one of the challenges with double-sided cards is prototyping. It's very easy for a company like Panda Game Manufacturing, the company that we work with. It's very easy for them to print on both sides of the cards. But when I'm printing at home, making a prototype, it is a little cumbersome to print on both sides. You got to align the sheet of paper just correctly. You got to, either run the sheet of paper through the printer twice, or you have to print two different sheets of paper and sleeve both of them. There are other different methods too, but it is a little cumbersome to playtest. I want to mention that up front. However, there are some really neat uses of cards that do this in various games. Let's jump in and talk about some ambassador picks first, and then I'll talk about honorable mentions, and then my top 10. Ambassador picks, and most of these, well, it's a variety. Games like Birdwatcher, which is one that I have not played, Ark Nova, which is one that I have played, Kanagawa, Air, Land, and Sea, Arkham Horror LCG, Broken and Beautiful, Eldritch Horror, Flip City, which I haven't played, Four Gardens, I haven't played that one, Sprawlopolis, Too Many Bones, I haven't played that one either, I need to play that one, and Tribes of the Wind, which I also haven't played. I would say of these, the ones that were most mentioned by ambassadors were Ark Nova and Tribes of the Wind. Doesn't mean necessarily that those are the favorite games of the people that picked them, but they were games that came to mind in terms of how those games use both sides of the cards in interesting ways, which I think is something to be said for this video in particular. My honorable mentions are Race to the Raft. Race to the Raft has these cards that they're cards that are forming a path for you on the board. And on the back side of the card is a general hint at what you might find on the other side of the card. I like that use. You'll see some examples of that in my top 10 list. First in Flight. This is a game that I've really been enjoying lately. I didn't include it on the top 10 list because there's only one card that uses both sides of the card, but it is a pretty helpful card. It's the Descend card, which you will use every time you take a flight. But when you're not taking a flight, you can flip that card over to the back side to remind yourself to put cards from your garage back into your deck before you begin the flight. They could have used a separate card for that, a separate token, but they had the back of the card available. It made sense for it. Fury of Dracula. I think this is a clever one. This is a game where you're drawing cards from a deck. I haven't played it in a while, so please excuse my lack of explanation about it. But I think what the Fury of Dracula does really well with this event deck is that the sides of the cards look mostly the same. I don't have a good example here, but here's like the back of an Expeditions card. So the edges of the cards look the same, but the middle of the card had something different on it. Some cards have something different there. So it's hard to accidentally see that when you're drawing cards. It's very easy to see the edges of the card. So if you had like the whole back of the card would be different to signify that something different is happening, that would be very easy to accidentally see. But if it's in the middle of the card, it's harder to accidentally see. Sentinels of the Multiverse. The villains in Sentinels of the Multiverse, like when the first time you defeat the villain flips over and becomes more powerful. I think usually more powerful, maybe sometimes less powerful, but usually more. And I think that's a great use of two sides of the card. Point Salad. I couldn't remember the use of this one. A lot of people mention this one, but I haven't played this one in a while. I don't know why it's on my honorable mentions and not ambassadors. Star Wars Outer Rim. This is one that a few ambassadors did mention this one as well, where a lot of cards have level up abilities, kind of like Sentinels in the Multiverse, but for your benefit, where you're leveling up the card and flipping it over. Trekking Through Time. I'll talk about more about that system in an example in the video. And then Marvel Champions, a game that I need to play more. I've only played Marvel Champions once, but Marvel Champions uses your character card as a double-sided card. One side is just your normal character, your Peter Parker, and the other side is Spider-Man. And so depending on which side of the card you are, gives you different abilities, different weaknesses, things like that. It has a pretty big impact on the game, whether you are your normal human version of yourself or your superhero version of the self, depending on the side of the card. There's only one Stonemaier game I could think of that uses the backs of the cards for anything even closely relevant, and maybe this is due to my aversion of prototyping cards with two sides in use, and that is Viticulture. Viticulture, and this is a little bit of a stretch for this, but in Viticulture, there are 4 different decks of cards that you're drawing from, and the backs, and you're keeping all those different cards in your hand until you decide to play them. And the types of cards that are in your hand provide important information to the other players. So if I'm holding my hand of cards and you can see that I have 3 green cards, 3 vine cards, and say 2 winter visitor cards, you can see that from across the table. You can see that I have a couple winter visitors and vine cards. You don't know what they are. You don't need to know that, but it is helpful for other players to see the types of cards that I have in my hand, knowing then that they might want to prioritize a plant a vine action because they know that I might want to plant a vine, given that I have vine cards in hand. At the same time, they might know that I'm going to take a winter visitor action, or that I'm inclined to do so because I have winter visitors in hand. I don't have summer visitors in hand, though. Again, something they can see, so they know there's less pressure for them to race to the summer visitor action spot. So I think this is a good reminder to me, and maybe you, that sometimes the backs of the cards can be helpful for other players when they're prioritizing something in a game that has a lot of tension and competition over limited actions or limited worker space and worker placement spots. Let's jump into the top 10 list. This isn't necessarily, this is kind of in a rough order of how much I like these games. It's also in a rough order of how deep these games go into the double-sided design of the cards. But this is a pretty flexible top 10 list as top 10 lists go. So the number 10 is So Clover. So this is a very mild example of two sides of the cards, but I think it's a good example because in So Clover, change that. I'm realizing on the fly that So Clover doesn't actually use both sides of the cards. I thought they did. I really thought they did, but they don't. You're catching me in real time here of an honest mistake. I thought that, so what I was going to say, I was going to laud So Clover for using both sides of the card because So Clover doesn't have an art budget. So Clover only had a word budget, so they could have put words on both sides of the cards. Maybe they decided not to because, I don't know. I don't know the reasons. Easier to shuffle, I guess, but really So Clover, I think, could have put words on both sides of these cards. It wouldn't have increased their budget, it just would have increased gameplay. Might have been a smart move there. So instead, I will slot Marvel Champions back into the slot, which is where it was until I thought, right before filming this video, that So Clover used double-sided cards. I'm sorry for that mistake, but Marvel Champions, I think, even though I've only played it once, I thought that double-sided nature of the card was really, really clever. And especially the idea that sometimes you need to refresh yourself, basically, and that's when you go back to your human character and you can do things that the human version of yourself can do. I don't think enemies can attack you when you're in your human character mode, but most of your strong, powerful abilities come from being a superhero or supervillain. I think you play only as superheroes in Marvel Champions, so it comes from being Spider-Man, basically. So I'll go back to that. That'll be my new number 10. Sorry about that mistake. It was So Clover. I will correct that. Paleo. Paleo is my number 9. Paleo is one that I've only played a few times, but Paleo I thought did something really clever, a little bit like what I mentioned for Race to the Raft. So in Paleo, it is a game where you are cooperatively trying to survive, trying to explore, and you can see the backs of the cards. The backs of the cards show you hints at what you might see. So for example, if you were entering a forest, you can see that the back of the card is a forest card, and maybe there's some paw prints in the forest. Maybe there's like a hint of an antler or an animal in the shadows. You don't know for sure if when you flip over that card, that animal will be there. Maybe they were there previously, but you're actually using your eyes to look at the back of the card and gain some limited information as if you're looking at the forest from far away and saying, I think something's going on there. I want to go there. And you're actually getting information from that back of the card that could come true as you flip the card over. I think that is a really great element for an exploration game, to give players a hint of what is to come, but not give them exact information until they get there. That gives you a true sense of exploration. I think Paleo does that really well with their double-sided cards. That's Paleo at number 9. At number 8, so this is what I alluded to earlier with Trekking Through Time, Trekking Through History. Yeah, Trekking Through Time, I think is the name of the game. Maybe History. I'll double check the name after I finish this. But the number 8 example is the game HerStory. So this is a somewhat, or it is a historically based game based on famous women throughout history, amazing women throughout history. And it is a fairly abstract game beyond that. What you're actually, you're collecting these women, you're kind of activating them, you're moving around a track. It's a little bit like Splendor with a touch of theme added to it. But what HerStory does really well, as does Trekking Through Time or Trekking Through History, I think it's Trekking Through History, is that the backs of the cards give you historical information about these women. There's a written description about the women. I thought this was really clever. And it's a good reminder that even though backs of cards in games are usually blank because it makes them easier to shuffle without giving away any information to the person who's shuffling it, sometimes that doesn't matter all that much. Sometimes you can just shuffle. You don't have to look at the cards when you're shuffling. You can kind of just shuffle under the table, next to you on the table. You're really, and HerStory, you're not gaining that much information if you happen to see the top card of the deck. And you do see the top card of the deck in HerStory. But I really like that use of the backside of a card to give you historical information, historical context. So you can actually learn something, especially when it's not your turn. Maybe you've already planned your turn, you have nothing to do. You can look at the backside of the card and learn a little bit of something when it's not your turn. So HerStory and other games that use the back of the card to give you historical information, fun facts, maybe even fake historical information if it's a fantasy game or sci-fi game. That's interesting too. Backstory. So that is HerStory at number 8. At number 7 is Architects of the West Kingdom. This is a game I love, but this is a fairly mild example. But this is using double-sided cards to show status changes. So let me see if I can dig this out. There are black market cards in Architects of the West Kingdom. Here's what the game looks like in case I didn't hold it up. The black market cards are double-sided to indicate. Let's see if these are black market cards. To indicate a good. Yeah. So here we go. So sometimes you might gain these black market cards. I believe that's what they're called. And it's a bad thing when you gain it. You have to move down on a track. Oh no, it's this side. They're debt cards. That's what they're called. They're debt cards. Here we go. There's the debt side of the card. And when you gain it, it's kind of indicating that you've gone into debt. But you have the opportunity, and if it's at that side at the end of the game, you lose some points. However, if you manage to flip it over onto the backside, you gain a little reputation. So there are ways in the game to pay off a debt, to flip over a debt card. And if you do that, right away when you flip it over, you gain a little bit of a bonus. So it's kind of changing your status. It's tracking your status of debt, paid or unpaid, and it's giving you a little boost when you flip it over. So it doesn't feel good just to get rid of a bad thing, but also feels good to gain a little good thing. I really like this use of debt cards in Architects of the West Kingdom at number 7. At number 6 is another game that's giving you a little bit of information in advance so you can plan ahead if you want to. And that game is Welcome To. Welcome To is a flip and write game that uses the backs of the cards. I'm trying to put Architects back. I'll do that later. So in Welcome To uses the backs of the cards to give you information about what's coming up next. So in a flip and write game, I think this is a really clever mechanism because even though it is completely random what the next card is, you have a feel for what it will be. In fact, you know what it will be. It's just you don't know the number. So you can see that this card will be flipped up soon, but you don't know the number on it until you actually flip it over. So I think that's really clever, that you can see that you have a pool coming up. And so you can plan ahead a little bit. Maybe you've been looking for a pool. Do you use a pool with a worse number? So say this one is previously up there. You have a pool with a 3, but you're like, a 3 isn't really ideal. I'm looking for a higher number. I can see that another pool is coming up. I'm going to wait for it and hope that it's a higher number. And wait, it is a higher number. I think this little bit of information in Welcome To is really, really helpful for players to give players a little bit of agency over their choices, even though the card itself is randomized and the number is fairly random. You have some information, like if you saw that 3 coming up, you know, okay, another 3 pool is probably not the next card, but you don't know what number is coming up. So that's Welcome To at number 6, giving you that little hint of information about what's coming up next. At number 5 is one of my recent favorite push your luck games, and that is the adorable Spots. Spots, very similarly to Welcome To, although not a flip and write game, is giving you information about the next card in the stack. So in Spots, you can have you're trying to complete these dog cards that have dice spots on them, and you're trying to place dice on them to complete the dog, to have the dog filled with the exact dice that they're looking for. You can only have a total of 6 cards at any given time, though. 6, whether they're complete or incomplete. And so here's a complete dog. This one's complete. You can see there's no longer a dice space on it. You can see where there was a die to place earlier, but there's no longer a space on it. Here's what the dog looks like before then. But this is what you see when the card is on the top of the deck. You can see the next card that's coming. You can even have the deck on this side if you want. You can see the next card in the deck. And seeing the next card is actually really, really helpful. And I guess you could essentially just flip the entire deck of cards over if you want to give players that information. But it is helpful, I think, here to show what you have completed rather than just having this be a generic back of the card. Like, it's nice to see that these are the dogs that I've completed, giving you a sense of completion and progress in the game, and a little bit of theme that you have Mayor in your house now from now on after you've completed them. But the card that you see, the card on the top of the deck is visible so that you have information. Oh, there actually was a 1 spot up there too. You have information about the next card coming, so you can decide at times, when do I want to draw a card versus placing dice on my cards. That gives you a little decision point, because some of these cards have a lot of dice on them, which might take longer to complete, but it gives you more options and makes you less likely to bust in spots. Some of them have fewer dice. So here's one with only 2 dice. So easier to complete, but fewer numbers, more likely to bust. So yeah, I really like being able to see the next card coming up in spots, so I can have a little bit of information about whether it's time for me to gain that card, or if I should hold off and wait for a different card for a turn when I want to gain some cards, or try to complete dogs, because whenever you complete a dog in spots, you gain a new card. That is spots at number 5. At number 4 is Magic the Gathering. It kind of baffled me, or not baffled, it intrigued me around maybe 10 years ago, maybe even longer, I'm getting old, when Magic announced that they would start printing some cards double-sided. It may have started with Innistrad with werewolves, where you had one side of the card and was one thing, was like kind of like Marvel Champions, was like your human version of that card, and then the backside was the werewolf card, and you'd flip that card over at certain times. Making that change in Magic meant that you always had to sleeve your cards, which I think was something that Magic was moving towards anyway. So that in itself was really neat, but since then Magic has done even more with it, where they have cards that evolve in different ways. Like you might have an enchantment turn into a land, or vice versa. You might have a normal card turn into a planeswalker on the backside of the card. And very recently they had dual lands, where they're double-sided cards, where there's like a forest on one side of the card and a mountain on the other side of the card. So when you draw that card, or when you play the card, you decide, at this moment, I really need a forest more than I need a mountain, and you can decide which side of that card to play on the table. I think that was a really clever innovation. Rather than sometimes cramming that information into one side of the card, they created double-sided cards. Obviously, it becomes a little bit cumbersome because you have to sleeve all the cards when you play Magic, but I think that's what most Magic players do anyway, unless they're playing really, really casually, as we do. So, Magic the Gathering uses using double-sided cards for evolving cards, and also just more choices, I think is really interesting. That's Magic at number 4. Number 3 is one of my favorite games, Ark Nova. Not all the cards are double-sided in Ark Nova. In fact, only a few of them are, but they are the most important cards in the game, and those are the action cards. So in Ark Nova, you start out with cards on the blue side. So these are your action cards, your 5 action cards. All the actions of the game are described on these cards, which I think is so clever. Great action selection system. And one of the biggest choices you make in Ark Nova at different times of the game is which card to upgrade, because at a certain point in the game, you get to gain an upgrade, and you get to flip one of these cards over for the rest of the game to the pink side. And so you have this build action becomes a better build action for the rest of the game. And cleverly, I think this was the right choice in Ark Nova. Cleverly, at most, you can only ever upgrade 4 of these cards. And so in any given game of Ark Nova, you will be left with 1 unupgraded card. I think this gives you a little bit of a feeling in Ark Nova of, I want to play this again. I want to try this, where this is a different card that I didn't upgrade, or I upgraded these cards in a different order in another game. But the simplicity of having these all together, all these cards all in one stack, there is one moment in Ark Nova where you shuffle these cards, but it's really easy to shuffle just a few cards onto the table and then lay them out. I think makes perfect sense that they use double sides of cards for these upgraded actions, rather than having a separate deck of cards or separate set of cards that you are bringing in for this purpose. So yeah, Ark Nova's action selection system, double-sided cards, brilliant system. I really, really love that element of Ark Nova. So that's Ark Nova at number 3 for their use of double-sided cards. Here's a game that I go back and forth on when I want to play, well, really any game, because I love both of these games, but Earth is my number 2 favorite game with double-sided cards. So in Earth, there are many cards in Earth. There's a ton of cards in Earth, and some of them are single-sided. Many of them are. But many of the cards that you get at the beginning of the game are double-sided. Let's see if I can find some examples here of some of the double-sided cards. Yeah, so here's a few of these cards. So some of these are single-sided. Only a few of them, really, right here are double-sided or single-sided. But look at this entire set of cards and these are 3 different types of cards that are double-sided. So these are starting cards that go on your mat at the beginning of the game. And what they do is give you a delightful choice, because you're going to be dealt a few of these cards, but rather, I believe in Earth, rather than being dealt 2 of each of these cards, you are dealt 3. So I'll give myself 3 right now. So I'll give myself 3 cards as an example. I'm given 3 cards, but essentially I have 6 cards right now. I was only dealt 3, but I have 6 because I can choose either side of these cards. And so I can figure out the right combination for piecing these together to fit my goals, to fit my early engine building, and I get these all at setup. And so it's a really fun, interesting choice at setup. And I think it's even great because if I don't know how Earth works, I can just look at the pictures and say, hey, I want to go for a Mediterranean feel for my island, and I definitely want this yellow-bellied marmot on my island. And since it's an island, it makes sense to have this volcano on there too. So thematically, you have that choice too. But I love that these are double-sided. It adds so much variety to the game, given that they made them double-sided. And I guess they could have, and the alternative would have been to double this stack of cards, have twice as many cards, and make them single-sided. But for an economical purposes and budgetary purposes, I think it made sense for them to make these double-sided. So yeah, I really like that aspect of Earth. The setup cards adding to the variety and asymmetry of your particular island, your particular game, really adds to the replayability of the game. So that is Earth at number 2 for the use of double-sided cards in this game. And finally, last, we have a very small game. I wanted to include a game from Button Shy Games, and I think Hierarchy is a wonderful example of a game that fully embraces the idea of double-sided cards. In Hierarchy, you have this deck of cards. This is the entire deck of cards right here, and both sides of the cards have the same information on them. They are simply just a different color. So you have the queen here. There's a purple queen, and there is, I guess, a gold queen here. And at the beginning of the game, you shuffle up these cards, and you deal half of them to each player. So you'll get this half of the deck, and I will get this half in purple. And then we'll play Hierarchy. I want to explain how to play, but it is a game where it's a completely open information game, because I know that the cards that you were dealt, I dealt those to you, are not the cards that I was dealt. So you know that it's open, a completely perfect information game where even though it is randomized at the beginning of the game, you know what I have, I know what you have. And so these cards are splayed out on the table. And it's important to look across the table to see in this game what cards the opponent has left. But I love this concept. I love that these cards are split every game, and the puzzle that emerges from this of me knowing that you have certain cards and that you know that I have certain cards, and the timing of when I'm ready to play those cards based on what I have left and what you have left. Because this is a game basically where you're trying to play a card such that your opponent can't play a card, which generally means you can't play a higher card. So if I play a 10 and somehow you cannot play a card higher than 10, then you can't play a card and you lose the game. That's a broad strokes overview of how the game works. But I just love the idea of shuffling up this deck of double-sided cards, giving you half of them, and me keeping the rest, but then having perfect information based on what just happened there. It's just so cool. I've been wanting to see this, I think, in a more complex game somewhere. And not that it's a bad thing for this game to not be all that complex, but you know, in a multiplayer, big game, because it's such a cool mechanism to have in this game. So that is Hierarchy, my number one use of double-sided cards. This game would be much more cumbersome without the double-sided cards. Possible, but definitely cumbersome. And I think it thrives based on this format of two sides of the cards being different player colors, and how the deck is split up in that way. So yeah, that is Hierarchy at number one on my list of games that lean into the idea of using both sides of the cards for key information on both sides of those cards. I'd love to hear your examples, though, whether they're elements of or ambassador picks or honorable mentions that you want to talk more about, if they're games on my list that you want to talk more about, or another game in your collection where both sides of the cards are used, or printed information on both sides of the cards is used in interesting ways. Let me know in the comments below. Thanks.